The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Miriam sat on the counter, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of red wine in her hand. She wore nothing beneath the silk robe draped over her body, the same robe Margaret once wore. She took a slow sip, savoring the rich taste as she waited. Then he walked in. Daniel loosened his tie, sighing as he tossed his keys on the counter. He looked exhausted, like a man carrying too many burdens. He barely glanced at her, at first. But then his eyes flickered down, noticing how the robe clung to her curves, how her bare thigh peeked through the parted fabric. He hesitated. Miriam smiled. "You're late," she said, tilting her head. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Had a long day. You always do." She set her glass down and slid off the counter, closing the space between them. He smelled of whiskey and expensive cologne, the kind that lingered on a woman's skin long after he was gone. His gaze dropped again, just for a second, before he caught himself. He was trying not to look. Miriam reached for his tie, letting her fingers trail over the fabric. "She's already asleep, isn't she?" she whispered. Daniel stiffened. Miriam's smile widened. "She doesn't even wait up for you anymore." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "But I do." And just like that, he broke. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him as his mouth crashed onto hers. The kiss was rough, needy, like he'd been fighting this for too long. Miriam moaned, tangling her fingers in his hair as he pushed her back against the counter. His hands slipped under the robe, sliding over bare skin. He groaned. "You're not wearing anything." Miriam smirked. "I was hoping you'd notice." His breath hitched. His grip tightened. He lifted her effortlessly onto the counter, spreading her legs as his lips trailed down her neck. She tilted her head back, gasping as his hands roamed her body, his touch hungry, impatient. This was what she wanted. He was hers now. Then a sound. A soft creak from the staircase. Daniel froze. Miriam's pulse quickened. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the shadows near the hallway. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Daniel shook his head. "Probably nothing." Miriam grabbed his tie, pulling him back in. "Ignore it," she whispered. And he did. Neither of them noticed the small white envelope that had slipped from Daniel's pocket onto the floor. Neither of them saw the delicate handwriting on the front. "Daniel, please read this. I need to tell you something." And just beyond the doorway, hidden in the darkness, Margaret stood at the bottom of the stairs. Her hands trembled as she clutched the railing, watching her husband press his body against the Maid, his lips trailing over her skin. She had come downstairs to leave him a letter. She had hoped, just for once, that he would look at her, that he would see the pain in her eyes. But instead he was here, with her robe on another woman's body. Margaret pressed a hand over her mouth to stop the sob rising in her throat. The pain in her chest wasn't just from the sickness eating her alive. It was from this. She had feared she was losing him. Now she knew. She turned, climbing the stairs slowly, every step heavier than the last. She never saw Miriam smirk. She never knew this wasn't just a mistake. This was the plan. Margaret wouldn't be around much longer. And Daniel, he would belong to Miriam soon enough. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the letter in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the pen to the paper, forcing herself to write even though her body felt weak. She had written so many letters. Too many. And yet, Daniel never responded. She placed this one on his nightstand, just like she had done the night before, and the night before that. Maybe this time he would see it. Maybe this time he would care. She glanced at the clock. He wasn't home yet. He never was. Her chest ached, not just from the illness, but from him. From the way he didn't look at her anymore, the way he didn't touch her, the way he slipped into bed late at night and left before she woke up. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she pulled his pillow into her arms, pressing her face into it. It didn't even smell like him anymore. She was losing him. No, she had already lost him. Downstairs, Miriam hummed softly as she set the tray on the counter, stirring the tea carefully before pouring it into a delicate china cup. She took her time, watching the steam rise as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny vial. A single drop. That's all it took. She tipped the vial, letting the liquid swirl into the tea before stirring it again, ensuring it blended smoothly. It was slow, undetectable. Margaret would only grow weaker over time, and everyone would believe it was the cancer taking her. Miriam smirked. Perfect. She picked up the tray, balancing it carefully as she made her way upstairs. When she entered Margaret's bedroom, she softened her expression, tilting her head in mock concern. Mrs. Margaret, I brought your tea. Margaret looked up from the bed, offering a weak smile. Thank you, Miriam. Miriam set the tray down, watching as Margaret reached for the cup with trembling hands. You don't have to wait on me like this, Margaret said, blowing on the tea before taking a small sip. Miriam smiled sweetly. It's my job, and I don't mind taking care of you. Margaret sighed, cradling the cup in her hands. You're such a good girl, Miriam. I don't know what I would do without you. Miriam's smile widened. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. Later that night, Daniel came home late again. He slipped into the bedroom, careful not to wake his wife. Not that she would have noticed. She barely moved in her sleep these days. He loosened his tie, tossing it onto the chair before rubbing a hand over his face. He was exhausted, but he wasn't thinking about Margaret. His mind was still downstairs, in the kitchen, where Miriam had been waiting for him again, this time with a teasing smile and that silk robe falling off her shoulder. He had wanted to stay. God, he had wanted to. But something about tonight felt off. He glanced at Margaret. She looked even thinner than before, her body frail against the sheets. Guilt twisted in his stomach, but he ignored it. Instead, he turned toward the nightstand, reaching for his phone. But his hand brushed against something else. A letter. He frowned, picking it up. The handwriting was delicate, familiar. Margaret. Daniel hesitated. He should read it. He should. But before he could open it, Daniel. He turned. Margaret's voice was weak, barely above a whisper. Go back to sleep, he muttered. She swallowed, blinking up at him. Did you see my letter? Daniel stared at her for a moment, then looked down at the envelope in his hand. It felt heavy. Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes searching his face. She looked so hopeful, like she just wanted to be seen. His chest tightened, and then a knock on the door. Soft, almost hesitant. Margaret's gaze flickered toward it. Who is that? Daniel clenched his jaw. He already knew. He turned, striding across the room, opening the door just enough to see Miriam standing there in the hallway. She didn't say anything. She just smiled. And that was all it took. Daniel glanced back at Margaret, still lying in bed, still waiting for an answer. Then he looked at Miriam. And he made his choice. Without another word, he stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. Margaret let out a slow, shaky breath, staring at the closed door. She waited, hoping, praying, that he would come back, that he would read her letter, that he would see her. But he didn't. And in the silence of the bedroom, the letter slipped from the nightstand and onto the floor, where it would never be read. Margaret woke to the sound of the door clicking shut. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, hoped she had imagined it. But when she turned toward the other side of the bed, it was empty. Cold. He left. Her chest ached, though she wasn't sure if it was the sickness or the truth settling deeper inside her. Daniel was slipping away. And now she was certain. He was slipping into someone else's arms. She swallowed hard, blinking away the tears. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry over him anymore. Instead, she reached for the nightstand, but something felt off. She frowned, patting the wooden surface. The letter was gone. Her breath caught. Had he taken it? Had he finally read it? For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred in her chest. She pulled herself up slowly, ignoring the pain that tore through her body. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe. A soft laugh echoed from down the hall. Margaret stilled. It was faint, but she knew that laugh. Miriam. Another sound followed, a low murmur. A man's voice. Daniel's voice. Her stomach twisted. No. No, no, no. She reached for the blanket, gripping it tightly as she stared at the door. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. But deep down she knew. She wasn't imagining anything. Outside the bedroom, Miriam pressed her back against the hallway wall, suppressing a victorious smirk. Daniel stood in front of her, his face unreadable, his body tense. You shouldn't be here, he muttered. Miriam tilted her head. Then why did you follow me? His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. She stepped closer, trailing a finger down his arm. She left you another letter, didn't she? Daniel exhaled harshly. Yeah. Did you read it? He hesitated. No. Miriam smiled, taking his hand and guiding him toward her bedroom. Then don't. And he didn't. The next morning, Margaret barely touched her tea. She sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around the cup, her gaze distant. Miriam stood across from her, watching closely. "You should eat something," Miriam said gently. Margaret blinked, forcing a weak smile. "I'm not very hungry." Miriam made a sympathetic sound, brushing a hand over Margaret's shoulder. "Maybe later then." Margaret nodded, setting the cup down. "Miriam?" "Yes." Margaret swallowed. "Did Daniel come home late last night?" Miriam's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know," she lied smoothly. "I went to bed early." Margaret studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right." Miriam turned away, smiling to herself. She was good at this. But later that evening, as she entered her room, something caught her eye. She frowned, walking toward the small wooden drawer near her bed. It was slightly open. Her stomach twisted. She reached inside, her fingers brushing over the familiar stack of papers, Margaret's letters. But something was wrong. She counted them. One was missing. Someone had found them. Panic rushed through her. She turned sharply, her pulse thudding in her ears. "Who?" And then she heard it. Daniel's voice, calling her name. She turned toward the door just as it swung open. And there he was, holding Margaret's letter in his hand. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes, they were filled with something she had never seen before. Something dangerous. Miriam opened her mouth to speak, but Daniel held up the letter. "You lied to me." Her heart pounded. He read it. He knew. And for the first time, Miriam felt something she never had before. Fear. The house felt empty without her. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun. The scent of white lilies, the ones Daniel barely remembered ordering, filled every corner of the room, suffocating in their sweetness. Margaret was gone. Daniel sat stiffly at the dining table, his fingers curled around a half-empty glass of whiskey. He had barely spoken all day. People had come, family, friends, neighbors, offering their condolences, their quiet murmurs of sympathy. He barely heard them, because all he could think about was the last time he had seen her, lying in that bed, frail, silent, alone. The funeral had been simple, elegant, just the way Margaret would have wanted. And yet he felt nothing. No grief. No sadness. Just a dull, hollow emptiness. Across the room, Miriam moved through the house gracefully, speaking softly to the guests, touching his shoulder as she refilled his drink. She looked beautiful today, dressed in black, her hair falling in soft waves around her face. But for the first time, Daniel didn't feel drawn to her. He barely noticed when the last of the guests left, when the front door clicked shut and the house fell silent. Miriam approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "It's over," she said softly, setting her hand on his shoulder. Daniel didn't move. She squeezed gently, leaning down so her lips were close to his ear. "She's gone now, Daniel. You don't have to feel guilty anymore." His fingers tightened around the glass. Miriam smiled, pressing a slow kiss to his temple. "I'll take care of you." Daniel exhaled, finally lifting his gaze to hers. For weeks, he had convinced himself this was what he wanted, that Margaret's death would be a release. But as he looked into Miriam's eyes now, something deep inside him stirred. Doubt. Later that night, Miriam hummed as she slipped into her silk robe, the same one she had worn the night she first had Daniel. Everything was falling into place. Margaret was gone. The house was practically hers. And soon so would Daniel. She glanced at herself in the mirror, adjusting the robe, making sure it draped just right. Then she turned, heading toward Daniel's room. She expected to find him in bed, exhausted, needing comfort. But when she reached for the door, it was locked. Miriam's brows furrowed. She knocked lightly. "Daniel." No answer. A strange chill ran down her spine. Something wasn't right. She turned slowly, her gaze falling on the one door in the hallway she had never touched. Margaret's old room. Her throat went dry. The door was slightly open. Miriam stepped forward, pushing it open further. The room was dark, untouched since Margaret had left it for the hospital. And then she saw it. The drawer near the bed, open. Her blood ran cold. She rushed inside, heart pounding, fingers shaking as she pulled it open all the way. The letters. They were gone. A sharp inhale sounded from the doorway. Miriam spun around. Daniel stood there, holding a stack of crumpled letters in his hands. Margaret's letters. His face was unreadable. But his eyes were cold. "You took them," he said quietly. Miriam opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had been caught. Daniel stepped inside, one of the letters clenched in his fist. You stole her words. His voice was eerily calm. You made her think I didn't care. Miriam swallowed hard, her mind racing for a way out. I was trying to protect you, she whispered, forcing tears into her eyes. She was sick, Daniel. She was already dying. I didn't want her to make you feel guilty. His grip on the letters tightened. Guilty. His laugh was hollow. She thought I abandoned her, Miriam. She thought I didn't care. And you, his jaw clenched. You let me believe she never left me a single word. Miriam's stomach twisted. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to love her, not hate her. Daniel, please, she stepped forward, reaching for him, but he pulled back. Stay away from me. His voice was sharp, final. Miriam's hands trembled. Daniel, He turned abruptly, striding toward the door. She panicked. She had come too far to lose him now. She knew about us. Miriam cried out. Daniel stopped. Miriam's breath was ragged. She knew. She wrote about it in one of those letters. Slowly, Daniel turned back. Miriam took a step forward, her voice softer now. She knew about us, Daniel. And she still loved you. Even when she was dying, she still wanted you. But you didn't even see her. Something flickered in his expression. Guilt. Miriam latched onto it, stepping closer. You belong with me now, she whispered. Margaret is gone. It's just us. Daniel's gaze flickered down to the letters in his hand. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Miriam reached for him again, this time touching his chest. Let me take care of you. For a moment, she thought she had won. But then he grabbed her wrist. Hard. Miriam gasped, her eyes widening as he pushed her back, his grip unyielding. You poisoned her, didn't you? His voice was dangerously low. Her heart nearly stopped. I don't know what you're talking about. You did, he said, his voice sharper now. You made her worse. You wanted her gone. Miriam shook her head, trying to pull away. That's crazy. Daniel's fingers dug into her skin. And you know what's worse? His voice dropped to a whisper. Her breath hitched. You poisoned yourself too. Miriam's stomach dropped. What? Daniel smirked. Margaret wasn't stupid, he murmured. She knew something was wrong. She wrote about it. Miriam's legs felt weak. You drank from her cup, Daniel continued, his voice slow, taunting. Used her things. Wore her clothes. Didn't you? Miriam's breath came in shallow gasps. Daniel, you think she didn't know? He stepped closer, his grip still firm. She knew. And she made sure you got a taste of your own medicine. Miriam felt like she was drowning. Her head felt light. Her stomach churned. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I would have noticed. You already feel it, don't you? Daniel leaned in, his voice a cruel whisper. The fatigue, the dizziness, the way your body is slowing down, little by little. Miriam staggered back. No, this couldn't be happening. But as she met Daniel's gaze, she saw it. He wasn't lying. And for the first time, Miriam felt real fear. Miriam's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the dresser, trying to steady herself. It wasn't true. It couldn't be. Her vision blurred for a moment, her stomach twisting painfully. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. She looked up at Daniel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He was watching her. Calm. Cold. Unforgiving. You're lying, she whispered, forcing herself to stand straight. You're just trying to scare me. Daniel tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Am I? Miriam clenched her jaw, shaking her head. If I were poisoned, I would have known. I feel fine. But even as the words left her lips, she felt it again. The dull ache in her limbs. The exhaustion that had been creeping in for weeks. The strange dizziness that she had ignored, thinking it was just stress. Daniel stepped closer. You drank from her cup. Used her things. Took everything that belonged to her. Miriam swallowed hard. His voice dropped lower. But Margaret knew. Her stomach clenched. No, she hadn't known. Had she? Miriam's breath quickened as memories started flashing through her mind. Margaret smiling softly as she handed her a cup of tea. Margaret watching as she slipped on her silk robe. Margaret noticing when she sprayed herself with her perfume. Margaret always watching. You were so obsessed with taking her place, Daniel continued, his voice edged with quiet fury. And now you're going to die just like she did. Miriam's body locked up in terror. A wave of nausea rolled over her. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the dresser tighter. She wouldn't let this happen. She had fought too hard. She had won. She had taken everything. She wasn't going to die. No, she gasped, shaking her head violently. I won't. I can fix this. I just need. She turned suddenly, trying to run, trying to escape. Daniel caught her wrist. She screamed, thrashing against him. Let me go. His grip was firm, unrelenting. You stole her letters, he growled. You stole her life. Miriam twisted in his grasp, but she was weaker than before. Her body felt like it was betraying her. Daniel, please, she sobbed. I love you. His face twisted with disgust. You don't even know what love is. And then he did something she never expected. He let her go. Miriam stumbled back, gasping for air. She turned toward the door, but the moment she took a step, her body failed her. Her legs gave out. Her vision blurred. She collapsed. Everything went dark. Daniel stood at the edge of the hospital bed, staring down at her. Miriam was barely breathing. Her skin was pale, her once beautiful features now gaunt, lifeless. The doctors had confirmed it. She had been slowly poisoning herself for months. Margaret had won. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He should have felt satisfied, but all he felt was empty. On the nightstand beside the bed, a single letter sat untouched. The last letter Margaret had written. Daniel picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. I knew, my love. I knew about her. I just wanted you to love me a little longer before I was gone. His throat tightened. Too late. It was all too late. He clenched the letter in his fist, his chest aching with something he couldn't name. Then, without another word, he burned it. The flames curled around the paper, turning the past into ash. And he never spoke of Miriam again.